Jackson, I just want to warn you that if I ask questions that seem challenging or even confrontational, don't take them that way. They're not. Just meant to be to provoke further thought and get your real, honest to goodness feelings about things. Also, in line with my ethnic culture, interrupting is just fine. Interrupt me when I'm talking. I might interrupt you when you're talking. That's how we talk. So jump in and let's take this conversation in whatever direction you want it to go. We will keep it wide open and free-flowing.
Thank you.
So do you want to say anything to start?
Sure. It's a great honor and pleasure to be here with you talking. This is great. This is the fun part of my work. This is like, I love this. So thank you for being here with us. And Alan, thank you for all your leadership and, you know, ongoing. It's been a great collaboration and friendship. So you have done incredible things, and the people in Iowa, like I said last night, have really been fortunate to have the kind of leadership from you and your colleagues at the Center for Violence Prevention, and a lot of people in this room are in that orbit, and some may be new to that orbit, but it's all great. So I'm really happy to be here and be with you, and thank you.
And my thanks to you, too, for those generous words in the introduction. Thank you. So, okay, here's my first provocative question for you, Jackson. When did masculinity become toxic? And why?
Oh, boy. Adam and Eve, maybe? Maybe the antiquity. I think what we're doing now in our culture is having conversations and critically examining hegemonic or dominant ideals of masculinity and masculinities in a way that was long overdue for thousands of years. So I think part of what we're doing, just like Me Too is not just speaking for, the women who are speaking out around the Me Too movement, if you will, are not just speaking for themselves or even other women in the world today. They're speaking for billions of women over centuries and millennia who never had a voice. I think some of us men who are doing the kind of work that critically examining masculinity and masculinities are doing work that is representing, you know, the accumulated human wisdom and knowledge, but also speaking for men who had never had a voice or an insight or an introspective nature about the ways in which power and privilege were played out and violence in men's lives. So I don't know if there's ever a starting point, but can I just say one other related piece is I don't use the word toxic masculinity.
You don't?
No, and most of the men with whom I work in this field don't like the term toxic masculinity. It's both for political reasons and intellectual sort of reasons, because there's a lot of confusion. A lot of people hear the word, who aren't in this kind of discourse, they hear the word toxic masculinity and they think that we're saying that being a man is toxic. And there's no subtle sort of understanding that it's a critique of certain kinds of dysfunctional behaviors that are associated with traditional notions of manhood, if you will. They just think it says men are just you know, toxic. And it's kind of, if you want to invite men into the conversation, it's not a good word, because a lot of men get defensive, and sometimes women get defensive for men, and therefore we kind of stay away from it.
Is there a term that you prefer?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know if there's a word that would directly supplant toxic masculinity, but you know, I would say dysfunctional behavior, abusive behavior, you know, the constraints, the limitations of traditional ideologies of manhood, things like that. But it's not as easily, and it's not as bumper sticker as toxic masculinity. And a lot of people get what toxic masculinity means. So some people are thinking, okay, it's obvious what it means, but I just don't think it's as effective. And one last piece. I know it's a long answer.
No, it's great. Keep going.
Thank you. Thank you. It kind of individualizes what is a systemic and social problem. So he has toxic masculinity. It's too individual. There's a deeper structural, sociological force underlying men's behaviors, and toxic masculinity seems like it's a personal characteristic, and it's also a medical model. So toxic suggests a sort of biological poison, as opposed to a deeper socially constructed identity and institutional power arrangement, which those of us who are trying to change masculinities, TIES, the plural, find limiting. So that's another reason why the term toxic masculinity is, like, for example, it's not oxymoronic, but there are two different discourses. Toxicity is about biology and, poison agents, and masculinity is a social construct. So you're having in the same phrase, you're having the individual and the society. You're having biology and social construction. It doesn't work for that reason as well.
So in the anti-racism world, there are workshops called, for example, Unlearning Racism or White Privilege. Is there a corollary with sexism that feels comfortable to you? Unlearning sexism, is that the kind of workshop you would conduct for men?
It's interesting. Again, it's a great question. I mean, so much of the work that I and my colleagues do in the anti-sexist world has foundations in the anti-racist world, with both practically speaking in terms of educational interventions and pedagogies and teaching, but also conceptually, because about power and privilege. So the civil rights movement, for example, was so foundational in developing the women's movement and the pro-feminist men's movement and the gay and lesbian movements and all these other, and the transgender movements. All these movements are built on top of the civil rights movement. I agree 100% that there's a metaphorical and practical overlap between the work that men are doing to challenge sexism, as there is white people to challenge racism, and power and privilege. It's about power and privilege, really, at its fundamental. The one what's the word I'm looking for? The one discomfort I have with the word learning and unlearning is something that I've talked about and written about, which is, a lot of people will say, like, violence and abusive behavior is learned, must be learned. If it's not genetically predetermined, it must be learned behavior. That's what a lot of people will say. And my argument is that that's a passive way of saying it. I'd rather say it's taught behavior, because everything that's learned is taught. And if you shift the onus of responsibility to those who are learning to those who are teaching, then it shifts the responsibility of those of us who are in a position to teach and to model and to shape ideologies about gender and race and sex and all the issues. And that includes the media, that includes the sports culture, includes parents, includes all kinds of people. So rather than thinking about it as the individual having to unlearn something, it's like we have to think about how we're teaching and how those of us who are older, are imparting our beliefs and our wisdom or lack of it to the next generation. That's just a slight pushback on the term unlearning. Although I do think there is a process of reconstituting understanding, which you could say is unlearning.
So I think that there may be different models that you use to educate groups that are just men versus groups that are men and women. And I was struck when I listened to your TED Talk, which had a lot of great points in it. One thing that initially rubbed me the wrong way was you said that gender violence, sexual assault, domestic violence are not a women's issue, they're a men's issue. And I thought, doesn't that in some way minimize both the suffering of women at the other end of that, as well as the efforts that women have made through feminism over generations to combat it? When you say that it's not a women's issue, because women bear the brunt of that, right? Men perpetrate it. But is that something that you would more appropriately say to a group of men, rather than a group of men and women?
Both. And I agree with your point. I mean, every time I say it, it maybe not in my TED Talk, so I shouldn't say every time, I complicate it by saying, of course, it's also a women's issue. I'm trying to make the rhetorical point that the idea of calling domestic and sexual violence and sexual harassment a women's issue is a way in which men shift accountability and responsibility off of ourselves and make it seem as if our behavior is really their issue. And victim blaming is so pervasive because it's a way to shift accountability off of the perpetrator. And so to reclaim sort of responsibility, the shift in language to say it's not a women's issue that good men help out with, it's a men's issue, even though I appreciate exactly, and I do agree with what you're saying, that there is a sense that it sounds like you're erasing women or erasing women's leadership. And and again, in all my talks, not my TED Talk, I go into some great length to talk about how women's leadership has been, utterly transformative. It's not just, I'm sort of making a rhetorical point to say, call it a men's issue. And I think that, by the way, degendering it, I'm not saying that you're suggesting this, but people who degender it, they say, why do you have to say men's issue or women's issue? Why can't you say it's a people issue, it's a community issue, it's a human rights issue, it's a social justice issue? All this degendered language, my argument is, if you use that kind of language, you're not going to bring men into the conversation. Because a lot of men just hear that women's human rights, social justice, public health, that's good stuff, but it's not really me. It's not, I'm not, and it's a way that a lot of men don't engage. And so I feel like you got to come right at it by saying, this is a men's issue. If you're a man and you see yourself as a responsible person in the world, you need to be addressing these issues. Not because you're a nice guy, but because you're a man who is responsible for addressing these issues. And so some of it's a rhetorical device, but I appreciate your point.
And also to call it just a people's issue or a human issue is to sort of pablamize the whole thing. It's, it's backed by generations of power and privilege and learned behavior, so taught behavior, learned behavior. But people's issue is way too generic, I think. It's about power and privilege. Is there a country or a culture that you think gets it right? We were talking a little bit before about your travels in Sweden, but I'm curious as to whether, are you from Sweden?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, maybe you should join us up here and tell us how you did it. Or righter, if not completely right. And why? What did they do?
Well, I'll start off by saying, no, there's no country that I could say is doing it right. There are countries that are better. There are countries that have been addressing gender justice in a more structural way, in a more political way, in a more resource-focused way. Scandinavian countries are obviously some of those countries. But that's in terms of formal political rights and certain kinds of legislation, and whether it's parental leave or health care or education, there's all kinds of societies, for example, like in Scandinavia, that are way healthier than the United States, but those countries still have deep problems of domestic and sexual violence and sexual harassment. And I've been, in my travels in Scandinavia, for example, over the last, 10 or 15 years, this is a conversation that I've had both publicly and privately with people, like, what's the difference between formal legal equality and then cultural practices and relational practices and sexual practices that are a lot harder to change than formal political and legal structures and formal equality, because there's a lag between, like in Sweden and in Norway and other Scandinavian countries, between the formal legislation that's in place and gender equality enshrined in law, if you will, and
here too.
Practice, yes. And I think the practice is deeper because it's cultural, it's historical, it's intimate, and that stuff, I don't think any country has solved that. At least in the modern world that I'm aware of, has solved it. We're in a long-term struggle. We all know this. We're talking about hundreds and hundreds of years. Like the modern women's movement, right? The modern women's movement. 50 years old.
Yeah.
This is nothing. 50 years, nothing. And when you think about the thousands of years that preceded it of cultural and ideological and political structures and belief systems that are so deeply sort of marbled into our psyches and our communities and our societies, that undoing that and making it healthy, it's a work of many, many generations. And I hope that when people look back, if we can survive, as a species, people will look back at the late 20th and early 21st centuries as a time of unbelievably rapid transformation. And even though people sometimes in the present think things are happening too slow, we need this to happen fast, if you take a step back, talk about 30,000-foot view, if you take a step back, it's unbelievable how quickly things have changed in historical terms. And I've always seen my work, and I know that a lot of other people see their work as part of a long-term struggle, and not something that's a quick fix. We need a piece of legislation, we're going to get there, and then we're going to have all, everybody's going to be happy, and equality is going to be there.
So let's personalize that long-term struggle. How did you come to be in the place where you are on these issues? How did you get woke, so to speak? Or were you raised that way?
Just like with everybody, it's a long story, which I can't I can't
synthesize into.
Well, I can't possibly do justice, just like anybody. If we went around the room, right, and asked people, how did you end up in this room at this conference on, Midwest, men's and Me Too and accountability? How did you end up in this room? Everybody has a story that, and I do too. I mean,
Was it a gradual process or was it a sudden awakening?
It was both. It was one of the, and this is, again, forgive me because it's just one anecdote, and I know that that's not, it's not fully informative, but when I was in college, as a 19-year-old guy, I was covering a rally of students women students organizing for better lighting on campus, because there had been a couple of rapes outdoors in a parking lot at my university. And I always say most rapes on college campuses happen indoors. The perpetrator knows the victim in 90% of the cases, and vice versa. In this case, it was a stranger situation in a parking lot. And so these women were organizing for better lighting on campus. And I was a journalist. I was a weekly columnist for our daily newspaper. But I also covered events, news events sometimes. And I was covering this event. And I remember thinking, and my response to these women was not that these women hate men, they've got an agenda against men, they're bashing men. It was more like I was inspired, like these women are standing up for themselves. This is what leadership looks like. And I remember feeling like empowered by it. And I had to think about that, obviously. Why was I not defensive? Why was I inspired? And then I had to think about, it's all women. Why are there only women out there when most men aren't committing rape, but the vast majority of rape is committed by men, and why aren't there more men out there? And it seemed obvious to me that that was a problem. And so I wrote a column about this as a young guy, and it was called A Man Can Only Imagine. And what I was basically saying was I was thinking about my hallmates in my dorm, which was co-ed by room. And so my women are on both sides of my room. And I remember thinking, like when I was a young guy, coming home from parties at 2 or 3 in the morning, totally carefree and not worried about my safety. And I know
Drunk.
that that's... What's that?
Drunk, I said.
There were no cell phones, cameras back then. So, I don't know. Yes, I mean, I'm sure that I was many times not in a state to be driving. But anyways, I was, like a lot of white guys in my generation and my cohort and everything, it's just not even thinking about my personal safety. And I remember thinking of the women on my floor had a completely different experience. They had to constantly worry about where they're going to be, who they're going to get home with, what their personal safety was like on a daily basis. And I remember thinking, if I were a woman and I had to live like that, I'd be so pissed off. And then when I see women who are pissed off, I was like, that's what I would envision, I would hope. If I were a woman, I would be out there. And then the same thing with, at the same time, I was a white guy thinking about racism for the first time, to be honest, in college, or in a serious way. And same thing, I was like, if I had to constantly worry about the daily indignities of racism, I'd be so pissed off. And heterosexual, same thing with, because I occupied certain categories of privilege like that. I was heterosexual as well, so I was thinking if I were a gay man, for example. I remember I had never met a gay person. When I graduated from high school, I'm old enough to say this, I graduated from high school, I had never met an openly gay person. And there's a lot of change has happened in the culture, right? But I remember when I was in college, my first experience with an openly gay person, many gay and lesbian people I had met, but not an openly such. A gay man came into my class in college who was from this organization called the People's Gay Alliance, which is a student activist group. And I remember thinking, I can't believe this guy just walked in and publicly identified himself as gay. It was to me, it was so like gutsy. I was like, this is so off the map. And I was impressed by this. And I remember thinking, as a man, as a white heterosexual man, I was like, I'm in a position to do something about all of these categories of injustice. It's obvious. And one last thing, I was also a really good athlete as a young guy and a really accomplished football player. So I was completely unintimidated by traditional male culture. I was like, I don't care what you're going to say to me. What are you going to call me some mangina? Like it's going to matter? I don't care. Wait, it's stupid. It's so stupid. And I had that self-confidence that I didn't care what people said. I was so, I know that what I'm saying is right, and I don't care what they say. And I had that advantage. And lastly, I'm also Jewish, And I'm old enough, again, to have many members of my family who were murdered by the Nazis. I had a whole side of my family killed by the Nazis. I had relatives with tattoos on their arms, old people from the old country who had literally in my family with tattoos on their arms from Auschwitz and from the death camp. So it's when you live with that, and in the shadow of World War II, and some of us of a certain age have a generation where we're connected to. I mean, World War II is in this room. World War II is in this room. The trauma of World War II is in my family, is in a lot of people's families in this room. And that's World War II. It seems like so long ago, and yet it's not really that long ago when you think about generations and trauma. Anyways, so being a Jew and knowing about, you know, the silent Germans and all the people who were silent and all that and then learning social justice concepts about silence is complicity, and if you need to speak up, and if you don't, then you're part of the problem, and hearing that from professors and activists on campus. I came of age at UMass Amherst in a time of, it was after the 60s, but there was still a lot of social and political ferment and activism, and I sort of, as a young guy, just totally absorbed it. And then I realized, the last thing is I realized that as a man, I was in a position to do a lot with the gender piece, and I think the gender justice is fundamental to social justice. It's not like a separate issue. There's no such thing as justice in the world without gender justice, and it's totally marbled into racial justice and economic inequality and gender and sexual equality. I got early on, in other words, that gender was one of the giant categories. And my concern with it wasn't just personal. It was like I was ambitious about, you know, changing the world, and I thought gender is such an important angle to changing the world, and where are the men? I'm going to be one of those men, and that's how it worked.
Well, bravo! Thank you for coming to that. I think it's amazing that you were able to straddle those worlds of football and feminism at the same time in that era. That's a cool story. So let's talk about Donald Trump. Perfect segue. I remember at the beginning of last year being at the Women's March in Washington and feeling this incredible spirit of energy and aliveness, like women were going to reclaim the narrative and take back the situation. And now, you know, we see what is going on under this Trump administration for women. And it is so dispiriting. The Brett Kavanaugh hearings, for example, I think all of that was galvanized under. For everything we knew, they went ahead and approved him and seated him on the Supreme Court. And I wonder if you feel that Donald Trump's presidency has done more to energize the feminist movement and various causes associated with that, or set it back.
Thank you for the question, but you know, it occurred to me, I know that we're doing this, you're the journalist interviewing me, but I'm curious what you think about that, unless you think that's a violation of the...
No, as I said, jump right in. No, fair game. I'm fair game for any question.
Okay, so what do you think?
I mean, more days than not, I feel extremely discouraged and sickened by what's happening and by the narrative that still comes out of this White House, but in so many different directions, not just for women, but, you know, for the planet and for immigrants and for democracy, and even just sidelining the role of the press, you know, these like ridiculous knee-jerk tweets that come out every day from this president that don't mean anything. Being this kind of, throwing this temper tantrum, which is very masculine, if we may go there, about the wall and shutting down the government for that, to get what he wants without any kind of negotiation, without any kind of reading or studying up on issues. And I think a lot of us are feeling incredibly frustrated. On the other hand, and I also know that after because I heard from a lot of these women, after the Kavanaugh hearings, after Christine Blasey Ford's testimony, and then, you know, this guy's combativeness as he came in, and hearing that his numbers rose because of that they were willing to concede, the Republicans, right, on the Senate Judiciary Committee, but instead they were invigorated by that combativeness of his and decided to seat him. The number of women who had sort of a form of PTSD after hearing all these things and were calling their counselors for support. I heard from some of those counselors. So I think that was a tremendous setback. On the other hand, I think that the Me Too movement has really helped give people a voice who haven't had one, and has also helped to put people on notice, abusers on notice, that they will be outed. But I'm curious as to what you think in that regard of the sort of fine line between legitimate outing of abusers and lack of due process for people who are being accused. I'm curious about your perspective on that.
Okay. So where should we start? Because we have Trump and then we have,
yeah.
Oh my goodness, there's so many issues. Yeah, and I appreciate what you're saying.
Start anywhere you want.
Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, with Trump, I always, almost from the moment of the election, my feeling was of, like many people, and women and men, people of color and white people who are, sort of conscious of injustice in the world. It was so deflating on so many levels. But to me, the biggest deflation is that 63 million people voted for Donald Trump for president. So though some of us have used Donald Trump for years as an example of the worst in sort of traditional white masculinity. It's like he's literally a caricature. I mean, for 30 years, this is way before he ever talked about running for president. It was like this cartoon character from New York City who flies in on his helicopter with his hair, and seriously, it's like a joke. And then the idea that he would be elected president, that 63 million of our fellow Americans would see that he was fit to be the president of the United States was so depressing to me and a lot of other people, in part because the work that we do, it's like Donald Trump is like the exhibit A of what we're working against for all these decades. It shows you how powerless on some level we were that Donald Trump was elected. Do you know what I mean? It's like we've been talking about how, talk about toxic masculinity. I mean, malignant narcissism, pettiness, insecurity, bullying, incredible sexual objectification, and entitlement, and it's so obvious. His manifest deficiencies as a human being are so obvious, and yet 63 million people voted for him, and overwhelmingly white people. So of course, race is an incredibly important sort of subtext of why that happened, and the backlash against the diversification and the multi-racial, multi-ethnic nature of the country. I know that. But it was also a backlash against feminism. It was also a backlash against women's advancement. And it's not a coincidence that Hillary Clinton, a woman, the first woman, was running against him. That's not a coincidence. It's one of the reasons why he was elected. And one of the reasons why he got the energy behind him that he did is that resistance to women's advancement embodied in Hillary Clinton, if you will. And it's complicated, I know. And I'm in Iowa.
Yeah.
And you've written many, many cycles of political commentary at a high level about the politics of Iowa and as it's foundational in what ends up happening in the country. But by the way, that piece about Hillary Clinton being a woman often gets pushed aside in the discourse about Donald Trump's election. And there was so much incredible misogyny that was revealed during that campaign and in the vote, which is still going to be, an issue in the 20,
Well, that was going to be my next question.
Right.
So what about Elizabeth Warren or Kamala Harris? What are their prospects in this climate?
Well, again, and I don't mean to miss the other piece of your question either, so I appreciate
I'm throwing them at you, so just take whichever one you want.
Sure, whichever one I can remember.
All right.
I know.
I'll slow down.
Just kidding. Just kidding. Well, the Kavanaugh hearings, it's related, I guess.
Yes.
It's all related. But the Kavanaugh hearings, to me, so much of what was going on in the Kavanaugh hearings was, I think that the vast majority of people believed that including people on the right, believed that Christine Blasey Ford was sexually assaulted by Brett Kavanaugh. I think that the vast majority of people believed it. What the divide was does that disqualify him from the Supreme Court or does it not? Not whether you believe her or not. I think a lot of conservative and Republicans and supporters of Trump and a right-wing Supreme Court believed that she was telling the truth and that believed that Brett Kavanaugh had done what she alleged that he had done. Their argument was that's just boys will be boys. That's just,
Wow.
that's guys do things like that. And it's also believable, and I don't know anything inside. I read a lot, but I'm not, I don't have inside knowledge. I believe that Brett Kavanaugh or other men could have committed that kind of behavior and not remembered it, and actually said with integrity, I don't remember doing such a thing, because it wasn't a traumatic event for them. It's just more normative. You know, you just get drunk, you do your shit, you know, it's like, I'm serious. And I think a lot of, well, I think the 2016 election, and I was saying this before the Kavanaugh hearings, was the boys will be boys election, because so many of the people, including white women who supported Trump, and you know, that became this huge discourse about white women, which, by the way, by focusing on white women, we don't focus on Donald Trump's central base, which is white men. And so white men take a pass when white women get focused on as the reason why Donald Trump was elected, because 53% of white women voted for Donald Trump. Way more white men voted for Donald Trump, way more. And so that's also part of the problem, is that women, of course, I think it's important to talk about white women, but it's not front and center as much as white men in terms of Donald Trump's constituency, if you will. And there's a class divide among women, because women with a college education voted for Hillary Clinton. In fact, more than that had voted for any Democratic candidate in the past 50 years. Did you know this? White women voted for Hillary Clinton more than they voted for any Democratic candidate in the past 50 years. You wouldn't know that if you hear the discourse, 53% of white women. It was a class divide among white women. Anyhow, the piece about the last piece that you had talked about, the 2020 campaign.
Right, and the role of women. I mean, is it just that Hillary Clinton was so roundly hated for one reason or another that she embodied, you know, a lot of what people didn't like in women, but a different woman?
Well, I think that if people haven't heard of the book Down Girl, The Logic of Misogyny by Kate Manne, the philosopher, this is a brilliant book. It just came out about a year and a half, 2 years ago, but you wouldn't know it unless you're kind of in the discourse of, you know, philosophical, you know, sort of, and sort of feminist academic kind of world. It's not like a popular book, but it's been lauded as a major book. But it is a major book. But her argument is that misogyny is the enforcement arm of patriarchy. It's not that men hate women, because a lot of people say, I love women. Like Donald Trump will say, I love women. So how do you reconcile men who clearly, on one level, love women, but on another level are clearly misogynist? How do you reconcile that? Among the many questions that she was addressing in this book, Down Girl, and her argument is that misogyny is really the response to women who don't conform to men's desires, needs, and wants. So when women don't conform is when the misogyny comes out. In other words, it's you're punished for not conforming to what I think you should be, or what systems think that women should be. So, for example, I don't think that Hillary Clinton drew so much resistance just because she was a woman. It was because she's a feminist woman. It's because she's a woman who is resisting. I mean, Margaret Thatcher is a woman. You know, Theresa May is a woman. There's all kinds of women
Gandhi.
who don't push those same kind of buttons because they're embodied as women, but they're not, the ideology that they're promoting, like conservative women, aren't challenging male power, and therefore they don't get the same kind of resistance. So to the degree that women are running for president in 2020 are seen as feminist women who are going to be pushing back against male power, that's when you're going to see the misogyny rise, rather than just because they're women.
Thank you. I know that we're running out of time here. I want to ask you one more question, because we've been picking on the Republicans, which I like to do a lot, but I want to ask you if you think that Democrats gave Bill Clinton a pass when he was president for what could have been actually sexual aggression towards women, that we tended to downplay, those of us on the left, and say, well, he just had affairs, that's a personal thing, it's a private matter. But you know how Trump made hay and brought in all of those women during a debate who had accused him of sexual improprieties. Do you think that Democrats just were deliberately blind to that at the time, or didn't know the extent of it, or what was going on there? Is there a hypocrisy going on?
To some extent, yeah. I mean, I think it's complicated, and I know we can't fully litigate that, you know, right now. But I think there is some hypocrisy and some political expediency. I mean, there's this notion that coming out, because Clinton was elected coming out of 12 years of really right-wing rule. I mean, again, those of us who are old enough to remember, the Reagan years were really bad for anybody who cared about racial justice, social justice, gender justice. It was really regressive time in American politics, the 1980s. That was my decade of my 20s, and I'll go to my grave resenting the fact that my whole 20s was occupied by the Reagan right-wing backlash against all the movements that I had cared about so much, the women's movement, the gay and lesbian movements, the civil rights movement, because Reagan was the leader of the far-right movements against, before he became president, against the social movements of the 1960s and 70s. And he moved from being the leader of a right-wing movement to being the president of the United States and enshrining that backlash into the White House. Anyways, so Clinton was like, many of us progressives were like, you don't support, Bill Clinton was a conservative Democrat, but it was like, okay, you need to just move out of the Reagan era and we're gonna overlook some of this stuff because, and early on we didn't know. I mean, the first thing that I liked about Bill Clinton when I engaged thinking about him in the early 90s, in the 92 campaign, was that he was married to a really strong woman and a real strong feminist woman, and that therefore he must be a decent guy.
Yeah, I think some of us gave Hillary Clinton a pass also for overlooking these things.
That's right. And so I think part of the thinking was, okay, if Hillary Clinton's with him and she's a really strong woman and she's a feminist woman, maybe some of this stuff is this right-wing kind of takedown of Bill Clinton. And there's some of it's denial and some of it's I don't want to know this because it's going to complicate everything. And so, but I do agree that there's a level of hypocrisy, and you have to be, if you want to be consistent and not be just partisan, blindly partisan, and you want to have credibility, you have to call out your own, and you have to call abusive behavior, even, by the way, can I just say, related to this, I think there's a lot of sexism on the left, and there's a lot of sexism among men in social movements, in the civil rights movement to this day, in the racial justice movement, in the movements against, in the environmental movement. There's a lot of sexism still among men who call themselves, forget about Bill Clinton, New Democrat, I'm talking about progressive men who are social justice activists, who have unchecked sexism, and that's been a passion of mine for years. I'll just say this declaratively. If you're a man and you're committed to social justice and you're not feminist conscious and you're not pro-gender justice and it's not a central part of your ideology, then you're not a real progressive as far as I'm concerned.
How does that sexism manifest itself? Real quick, because I know we're done. 1 minute. I mean, it used to be back in the civil rights movement that women were given subordinate positions in the movement, right? So they didn't get to speak as much and men sort of took control. But I'm wondering now, are there different dynamics or is that still the same dynamic? There's been some progress. I mean, there's a greater consciousness, and Me Too is coming to the left. I mean, there's sexual harassment in, Bernie Sanders' campaign, and stuff like this is starting to surface. So there's actual, literally, on a personal and interpersonal level, there's sexism and sexual harassment and forms of mistreatment. But I think a lot of it is also emphasis on what issues matter, and what issues are seen as kind of, those are softer issues. Those are women's issues. And the central issue is, like, for example, historically on the left, the class is the central issue. It's like everything is subordinate to class. And to me, that's sexist because class should not, in my opinion, subordinate gender. It should be marbled together. If you have a sophisticated 21st century understanding of how do you make change, it has to incorporate class and gender and race and ethnicity. The problem, I think a lot of people, including men on the left, is that they see women's issues as like a side issue that they'll support, but they won't center it and they won't make it their priority. And I think that's a problem. Thank you. Do we have time for a question or no?
Yes, we absolutely will do that. I would entertain 2 questions and two fairly quick responses from Rekha, from both of you, either of you. So questions for either Rekha or Jackson, anyone? Cody.
So a big issue that I also work with is trying to center that vision for liberal or progressive identified men. Thank you. About making gender justice part of their ideologies, part of their centering. What are tactics and ways we can start to bring liberal and progressive identified men into that conversation so they don't feel like this isn't their issue or that they just can slough it off, but how can we start to engage them in understanding that all justice is centered around gender justice?
Great question.
Good question.
Do you want to?
No, it's yours. You're the one who deals with men.
Oh boy. Well, it's a great question. I'm under the promise to try to be concise. This is like so important. There's so many issues. But I said something last night about Jordan Peterson and the appeal of Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro and all these podcasters who are getting millions and millions of followers, especially white men and young white men. And the short answer, and I can't do it justice, the short answer is we have to create a narrative on the left and among progressives that brings white men into the positive change that has to happen rather than see them as the source of the problem. Because part of the appeal of the Jordan Petersons of the world and the Ben Shapiros of the world and they articulate this, and I listen to this stuff, and I read this stuff. I've been, paid close attention to the right for the last 35 years, is they say to young white men, the feminists, the multiculturalists, they all think that you're the problem. They all think that you're a bunch of, toxic masculinity assholes. And you're the reason why we have all these problems. But I, Jordan Peterson, Ben Shapiro, know that you're a good person, you're an important person, and that white men built this civilization, and Western civilization is built on the backs of, white men's intellectual and political, and work. And it's totally problematic on so many levels. But they hear this inclusive message from the right. On the left, they hear a lot of, you're the problem. And so I think we have to create narratives because some of us have figured this out. Some of us, I'm a white guy, and I figured out how to be part of progressive movements without losing my, identity in some way. We have to figure out how to communicate that in a much better way, because I think there's an awful lot of young white guys who are confused, who don't know what to do, who might have instincts in a certain direction, but they don't feel welcome. And how do you... Honestly, this is part of the work of men doing this work, because I don't think it's fair to put it on this burden, so many other burdens on women and people of color. It's like white men should be taking the lead on this one, is creating a narrative about how we can include those men. Alan Johnson, who I referenced last night in The Gender Knot, the brilliant book that I referenced, The Gender Knot, Unraveling the Patriarchal Legacy, our patriarchal legacy, one of the things that he says is when members of privileged groups wait for the members of the subordinated groups to tell them what to do, that's a form of illegitimate privilege because it's not their responsibility to tell you what to do. They have enough to do on their own.
Right.
So what that means is men need to take some initiative, not just wait for women to ask us to take the initiative, but take the initiative. It doesn't mean you don't do it in dialogue, in concert. You don't just run off. I'm not saying that. But you do have to take some initiative. And I think this is one example of where white men need to be front and center in talking to other white men and figuring out how to counter those narratives.
Have you ever thought, Jackson, about having a radio show on like AM talk radio that would be the antidote to Rush Limbaugh that could just speak to people directly?
I have thought about that.
Have you?
But I mean, the problem on the left is that you have to say if it's going to be AM talk radio, which is getting kind of obsolete. I mean, even though it's still huge, the podcast is the other place because AM talk radio is advertising supported, and if I start talking about my economic analysis, they would cut the mic in about 3 seconds. You understand? This is what it is. Corporate media is, they're not gonna put on left-wing points of view. That's the other thing in this country is, there's no left that's represented in the mainstream media. It's liberal to the right, all the way to the right, but the left is completely absent from that discourse. So I would have a little bit of a problem because some of the things that I would say would be
too intellectual, too highfalutin,
or too
in your face,
too progressive. but yes,
all the more reason why it has always baffled me why the left doesn't have the converse to that. And I know when Rachel Maddow appeared on the scene on MSNBC, that was just a bolt of lightning. It was wonderful. But
I know.
We need that on talk radio. There's one more question there.
I think that Jackson, you got into this a little bit, touched on it a little bit, talking about the need to have this conversation in a gendered way. I think one thing I struggle with is when we talk about gender-based violence, sometimes we get a pushback to the degree in which we're told that we're upholding the binary and upholding the patriarchy by talking about violence from a gender-based lens. How do you suggest that we respond to that in a way that's inclusive to non-binary and trans individuals?
Great question. Well, this is a piece of this, is there's often, I've written and talked a lot about the passive voice, the use of the passive voice in discussions about gender violence. So we say how many women were raped last year on college campuses rather than how many men raped women. We'll say how many girls were sexually harassed in the Des Moines school district last year rather than how many boys sexually harassed girls or girls sexually harassed girls. In other words, there's all kinds of ways in which the language, including the passive voice, contributes to our not focusing on the accountability of the perpetrators or the dominant group. And a lot of times people will ask me the question, they'll say, what about violence against transgender women of color? What about that? We need to talk about the violence against transgender women of color, which is a passive construction of a question, right? Because who is committing violence against transgender women of color? It is men, and it is people who identify as men, including men of color and white men. If you reverse it and talk about the dominant group, then you're being more, if you want to, let me back up a step. In a high school setting, because it's easy to look at a high school as a confined social unit, if you want to reduce violence against transgender kids, kids who are outside the binary, kids who are gender non-conforming, you don't work with those kids. You work with the hegemonic center of the high school. You work with the football team, the hockey team, because the violence and the policing takes place against the margins, takes place from the center. If you want to be inclusive and you want to help people and you want to treat them and you want to give them the services they need, okay, work on the margins. But if you want to reduce the violence and harassment, they're not the ones committing the violence and harassment. The violence and harassment is coming from the center. So working on breaking down traditional ideologies of manhood is the way to reduce violence and abuse and discrimination against people on the margins. The question is, how do you do this and not be exclusive in your language, in your rhetoric? And I'm guilty of this, believe me, I understand. I'm guilty sometimes of not, of staying within the binary in my, rhetorical, language use, and I appreciate that. So it's an art and not a science. I just think, this is one last political point. I think it's important to be gender inclusive, but not gender neutral. Because I think what's happened is some people say, well, let's just use gender neutral terms, that way we'll be inclusive of everybody. I think that's the enemy of the social change that has to happen. It also erases billions of women by trying to be gender neutral. We don't live in a gender neutral world. And so how do you do both at the same time? How do you be inclusive to people who are not binary, but at the same time not erase women, the category of women, and the central binary that human societies are organized into? How do you do that? Last point. I just want to correct something that I said last night, because we had a really interesting conversation. I see Russ up there and Chuck and a whole bunch of us, Ward, were having a discussion last night after the talk. And I used the phrase hurt people last night. And I've never used it in public, and I did last night. Hurt people. And we had a critique. People were critiquing the use of the term hurt people. And you know that term, right? And it's interesting, and so, again, I can't do it justice now, but I wanted to say that I appreciated the conversation because it did complicate that term. Because, for example, a lot of hurt people help people. A lot of hurt people, including a lot of men who are trauma victims, and who, like myself, to be honest, and a lot of others, end up doing social justice work and helping others and becoming healers and doctors and therapists and firefighters and Coast Guard members and do helping work. And so it doesn't mean, just because you're hurt doesn't mean you're going to hurt other people. And then there was other conversations about what are the motivations for people who hurt other people. It's not always coming out of trauma. It's also power and privilege. It's complicated. I just wanted to say that to correct the public record, because it's deeper and richer than is suggested by that short phrase. So thank you for that opportunity.
Thanks for clarifying that. But I do think it's an important and powerful phrase. I mean, I do. I appreciate you using it.
Thank you.
It's just more nuanced.
I want to thank you both for being here
And
this
get us off
morning,
the
for
stage.
sharing it. Help me thank Rekha and Jackson.
Thank you. Thank you. Really enjoyed it. Great fun. Thank you all for being such a great audience. It's really a pleasure.
Thank you.